Rock and roll, good way to say
it. Here we go. Yeah, there you go.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, welcome to the Network of Family Businesses, and I think it's time to rock and roll here with The Who and Jeff Savlov and getting this whole thing going about generations. So I had to throw that in there as the opening because that's kind of what Jeff and I were talking about here in the beginning. But welcome to the Network of Family Businesses, and our special guest today is Jeff Savlov. He is the principal of Blum and Savlov, and they consult the family-owned businesses. And he brings over 25 years of experience into this field, and he helps the enterprising families to balance family and business issues so that both thrive for many generations. Jeff holds a Master's of Social Work from Rutgers, and he's with a specialization in group dynamics and family systems theories. He's consulted with Fortune 500 companies and predominantly with family-owned businesses. Jeff also received a certificate in family business advising from the Family Firm Institute, and most of us know that as FFI. Jeff is also the founder of the Princeton Family Business Consultants Group, and that's an interdisciplinary group of professionals serving enterprise families across the U.S. and working to develop best practices. And that's really where I learned to know Jeff and appreciate and value what Jeff brings to the table. I'm privileged to participate in that with Jeff, and I really appreciate and value that. Jeff enjoys sports and coaching sports and ice hockey and mountain biking. And Jeff, it is really great to have you here today.
Thanks. Thanks, Steve, for the nice introduction. You know, it's funny, the rock and roll references and talking about my generation. When I first came up with the title, I asked you, Steve, if you thought people would get it, and your response was something like, you know, at least the hippies among us will. So I don't know if we've got a bunch of webinar attendees who are smoking pot and listening to Joan Baez in the background, and they're the only ones that are going to get the reference. But whoever's out there, welcome and glad to have you aboard. And the truth is, it's not just sort of the hippie generation that will get this reference. In my experience, this is sort of a little interesting generational tidbit. High school kids today are very much into sort of retro hard rock, 60s, 70s rock, and I see in my family therapy work that I also do, in addition to my consulting work, I work with a lot of adolescents, and a lot of high school kids are into vinyl nowadays. So everything old is new again, and vinyl and Led Zeppelin and The Who and my generation, it's kind of all coming full circle. So it's kind of interesting.
That's fascinating. Jeff, one bit of housekeeping for our membership on board. We want to make this interactive as we go through this. So again, for those of you that are familiar and those of you that are new, in your control panel, if you have a question at any time during our discussion, just type your question in there and send it to me, and we'll get Jeff to go over that, talk about that, and we'll have a time for Q&A at the end as well, because we really want to make this as educational and as interactive as we can. So having said that, Jeff, let's take her away.
Yeah. Everybody, please feel free to jump in and shoot your questions out to us. My slide's not okay. There we go.
There we go. I just did that.
Yep. Okay. Let me see if I can get the next one. In terms of generations being together, just some interesting information, statistics I came across. It's the first time in the history of humans, really, in the history of human beings, that we have 4 generations, even 5, living and working together. You know, it's interesting. I had this slide together talking about 4 generations living and working together, and then last week my brother-in-law my brother-in-law's grandmother passed away. I wasn't very close with her, but I went to support him. And what was interesting was, again, just last week, is that there were 5 generations alive and at this funeral. And even after this 90-plus-year-old woman had passed, there were still people in her generation and 4 subsequent generations. So even you could even substitute 5 in this bullet, 5 generations living and working together. It's really the first time that we've had this. If you look at the 900 of the last 1,000 years, so from the year 1000 to the year 1900, humans lived about 35 years. And of course, that's an average. Some people live longer. Certainly plenty of young children and infants, newborns died of childhood diseases. But the average was 35 years. So there just weren't lots of generations having to interact with each other for most of the time that humans have been around. People born in 1900, you have a big jump, and they tended to live an average of 47 years, and that's significant. People born in 2003 are expected to live an average of 78 years. That's really a massive jump. You know, you have from 35 to 47 years, and then a much bigger jump. And many people born in the last couple of years and the next upcoming year or two are expected to live many, not average by any means, but up to 120 years. So there are going to be more and more situations where generations are alive and doing things together, and certainly for family businesses, this is a real impact. As you know, nowadays, as you know, Steve, you have people in their 50s who are waiting for their chance for somebody ahead of them to retire so that they can have an opportunity. We're only going to have more generations in line for their shot at leading, you know, family business.
Yeah, I think some of those issues will come up in our later conversation as well, but that is so true.
Yeah, and you know, evolution moves slowly. It takes evolution, it takes humans a long time to really adjust, and the speed of change currently in our society and our world is just lightning fast. There's more information available to us, and change is happening in faster speeds than ever before. So it's going to take some time and thought to get it right, and certainly with regard to families who are sharing assets in business together and being entrepreneurial together, understanding the generations is really one big piece of the puzzle of being successful. One thing I wanted to say is that, you know, this information I'll be talking about today in the webinar is useful to all businesses, even non-family businesses. And the reason I think it's important to present it to a family business group is that all business is challenging and complex. I mean, I really believe that business in itself is challenging and complex and competitive. Family, aside from business, is absolutely challenging and complex. And I say this as a family member with siblings and parents and cousins, not in a family business. And part of my growing up, as I think you know, Steve, was that I was in my family's commercial printing business that we had in New York City, and I worked there. And so I've had both experiences, and I can honestly say that being a member of a family on its own has its challenges. Being part of a business is challenging, but when you combine the two, there's an extra layer of complexity due to that interplay of family and business that really, in my mind, requires proactive, ongoing management. You really need to be on top of that complexity and how you balance that interplay of family and business. And I think understanding the generations is just one more tool, an area of opportunity to understand and manage that complexity.
Absolutely. That complexity grows exponentially when you put all of the stuff that you just mentioned together. Family, business, generations. That's an exponential growth of complexity, really.
Absolutely. So in terms of the webinar, I'm going to take a look at what is a generation. What are the 4 generations that we have sort of officially named right now, and what are their characteristics? Take a little bit of time on their attitudes toward work, because they're very different. They grew up in different times, and their attitudes toward work are really disparate. Take a look at some of the challenges and opportunities specific to family business and how to manage them, and then specifically look at 2 areas, work-life balance in terms of the generations and how they view work-life balance, and how they view technology. And you know, this is a brief overview. We have a little less than an hour, and there's a lot of information here. So at the end, I have a couple of books that I found really interesting along the way, and you can certainly learn more with those. And I'm not going to be reading off slides the whole time, but I will read this one word for word, which is that a generation is a group of people who, based on their age, share a common location in history and the experience and mindset that accompany it. And what's crucial here is that it's not just an individual experience, something that one person went through or people in one town went through. You know, maybe there was a big fire or you know, something to that effect in a town, or maybe there was in high school an awful drunk driving incident, which unfortunately, you know, still happens too frequently, and that affects a whole town. It's more than that. It's really a large group of people that share this common location in history and time. And a generation is defined by having these common experiences and a mindset that goes with it. Always important to say that, you know, whichever generation you might find yourself in, and I'll go through this sort of the names and the time periods and the sort of the breakdowns of what, you know, when people were born and which generation they're in. Whenever you were born and whatever generation you were sort of officially in, it doesn't mean that you are exactly like that generation personally. People are individuals. There's always exceptions. But people from the various generations tend to be similar, not exactly alike, but similar in ways that are pretty exceptional and interesting. So you can take a look here. These are the main generations, and I wonder, anybody out there who wants to sort of write in, and certainly you, Steve, what stands out when you look at this? You have the name of each generation, the years when people were born who are members of that generation, the number of people in the generation, and then I put their current ages, the ages that they would be. What, if anything, strikes out for you, Steve, or anybody out there who is interested in kind of typing us a message? What strikes you?
I'll give them just a second or two to put something in there, but I think one of the things that jumps out to me, actually I have two, but I'll see if somebody comes up with the second one, but yeah, there we go. We got it. Somebody, I think, hit it right on the money. The 46 million for Gen X, basically being half of what every other cohort is.
Absolutely. Any other guesses coming in from the peanut gallery?
Well, that was one of mine, and thanks, Karen, for that one. But I'm also looking at the traditionalists and your boomers there, and looking at that. What is now? I'm going to show my math skills here. 150 million, and those are the ones that basically control the ownership and leadership, and that's where the trillions of dollars will be transitioned from to the next generation.
Right, massive transition going on right now. We probably all heard the statistics, but trillions of dollars being transitioned, in the coming years. And so, yeah, the 46 million is really significant, because if you look, before them is 80 million, and after them is 76 to 90 million. So there are a lot of ramifications for that. One of them, for sure, is that as you have the baby boomers getting older, you have significantly fewer people to take their positions, and that gives Gen Xers a lot of bargaining power, because there are fewer people and more jobs for the most part. And I'll talk more about the ramifications of that as we move on. The other thing is, when you look at traditionalists, yeah, it's 75 million, but it's a 45-year time span. It's really two generations. And they were so similar based on the fact that they each had their own world war. They had the Great Depression, really tough times. They were so similar, and the people sort of had a similar kind of experience that they were lumped together as traditionalists, but it's really two different generations, each of about 35, 40 million. So the numbers of 80 million baby boomers is really significantly more. You have 80 million baby boomers in an 18-year period as opposed to 45 years on traditionalists. So it puts the boomers in perspective a little bit.
Jeff, just out of curiosity, before you move on, just out of curiosity, what would you see as the next pivot point for coming after Gen Y? And I realize it's not a precise, well, it starts in 2000 or 2001, but thinking back over the last 14 years since 2000, we had the 08 financial issues, and where would you project that next pivot point for another cohort might start?
Yeah, I mean, it'll certainly be 2001 to about 2020. I think the significant issues will be terrorism, and certainly Gen Y. We're very young when September 11th happened, but one of the characteristics defining it will be terrorism. Certainly the financial crisis and the tough economy, and the way that Washington now is experiencing levels of conflict that I think it's fair to say we never saw at this level before. Those are all things that will kind of affect their generation. Did you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I guess in my mind I would think it might stretch out to 08 or 09 because of some of the significant issues nationally for us as a United States, and then globally. And obviously that's a guess. It's hindsight's always easier later down the road. But here's another question actually that did come in, Jeff. Given that there are less children per family, what makes up the 70 to 90 million in Gen Y? So I think less Gen Xers and more Gen Y.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure to the answer to that. I'm not a demographics expert, but I think it just has something to do with the number of boomers that had kids. So you have 80 million boomers, and then at least for the younger boomers, those numbers, these are their children. If I got the math right on that. So part of it is just and I think they even call them sometimes the boomlets. Again, demographic, family business is my expertise, and this is an area that interested me, and so I dug in and did a little research, and I'm happy to sort of share ideas and also hear what you and people who are on the webinar have to say. So that's kind of a guess, and I remember reading something about this boomlets idea, which is the children of the boomers, and I think that's part of where that number comes from.
I would agree, and I think too, and I think the member just kind of shot us another note. Some of that may also have to do with immigration and some of those other issues. So I think it's a lot that goes into that and making the Gen Y. But I think back to your point, Jeff, the difference of the cohorts and recognizing those differences is really a key to this whole thing.
Absolutely. Now, if we were live, let me see. I'm having trouble getting to the next slide. Thanks. Was that you, Steve?
That was me.
Okay. Yeah, it seems to occasionally work. I'll let you know if I need a new slide. Cool. If we were together in the same room, I would do a kind of exercise where everybody could take a moment and look at their formative years, their childhood, early teen years, and just kind of think of some examples of what they experience in terms of work and technology and relationships and money and world events, politics. Since we're not in that kind of a situation, I'll just be a guinea pig and stick myself out there. And if Steve, you can look at these while I go and add anything from your life, or anybody wants to type in an example of any one of these 5 areas and something that they experienced that, and again, it's not something that was personal to your life and your family, but it was really something that lots of people went through together that makes a generation. So for me, both my parents worked. Certainly in the traditionalist era, that was much more unusual to have both parents working. It was pretty common when I was a kid, and you had latchkey kids where kids would have their key kind of hooked onto their belt loop, and they would come home and let themselves in until their parents got home, and that was a whole dynamic that was really big in the years that I was growing up. Also in terms of work, there were periods of really high layoffs, and a lot of people lost pensions based on various, sometimes not legal, and sometimes just economic, but people that had worked hard. I know this happened to my dad, who is a blue-collar guy and was a printer before we started our own business, and that was the family business I referred to, but he wound up losing probably half of the pension that he had saved. And so where traditionalists, you often had one working parent and one parent staying at home. In the Gen X, it wasn't unusual to have both parents working, and then for a parent to experience a layoff or losing a pension that had been given along the way. Technology, this was a really interesting time, and I'm not sure the ages of the people on, but people who are younger might think this is odd, and people who are older will certainly remember it. But it was the first time that you could actually, TV was something that it was around when we were born, but you could never do anything more than turn it on and off, and eventually cable came. Cable was a big deal, and then you had this wire from the TV to the cable box, and it was almost like a remote control, which came later. But it was the first time that you could actually make something happen. You could control something on the screen of an electronic device, of a TV, and it was Pong. Did you remember that, Steve, Pong?
Well, you know what? I got to go back farther than that, Jeff, because I remember, now I can't even say the right word, community phones, party line phones. And,
okay.
You lift up the receiver and you hear your neighbor talking and you can't make your call yet. You have to hang up. So I'm going back a little bit on that one.
Okay, so you're a baby boomer.
I'm a boomer.
You're a boomer. And so, so for you, it was going from party line phones to, your own private line. For me, it was, certainly Pong, where you had the 2 paddles and the ball, and you could actually, take your little dial and make something happen on TV. Now Gen Ys are born swiping their little toy phones that they're giving as babies because they just see so many people swiping. I mean, this is real. I've seen, little 1-year-olds pick up a toy phone and try to swipe it because they see everybody swiping. For me, it was amazing to be able to control that little paddle. We also had phones on the walls. The phones were wired into the wall. They had long wires. At first, they were short wires, and then it was like the greatest thing to get a 30-foot wire with a curly Q that you could stretch into the next room and have some privacy. much easier with cell phones today to have privacy, but those were big deals. Relationships. I don't know if anyone out there remembers Marriage Encounter, but it was really popular in the 70s. My parents did it. They had a Jewish marriage encounter. They had a Christian marriage encounter. And you know, just sort of psychology and talking about feelings and respecting feelings and openness and relationships became much more commonplace. Traditionalists, they didn't talk much about feelings. These people went through world wars and depression, and they were just happy to work and make some money and eat, and talking about feelings wasn't really a big deal. But relationships and psychotherapy, you know, I remember as a young child when my grandfather had died and I was really close to him, and I was really having a hard time, my parents took me to a therapist, and it was a really good experience. A traditionalist never would have thought of it, and I'm sure my living grandparents thought my parents were crazy for taking me to a shrink just because someone died in the family. But it was a major part of the generation. You know, it kind of went along with sort of the hippies and peace, love, and, you know, express your feelings. At the same time, divorce rates tripled. And so that, and again, these are all generational things. These are things that happen on a large scale. Divorce tripled and had effects that rippled throughout the generation. Money, as I've said, when I was younger, there were sort of hippies who were older kids, and they kind of eschewed materialism. But then as a young teen, like the movie Wall Street, I believe, came out when I was in my early teens, and this idea of the yuppie, which was an acronym, Young Urban Professional, YUP. And so in my really early childhood, there were these hippies who didn't care about, you know, money or material possessions. And then as a teen were these yuppies who wanted, you know, a BMW and lots of money and just very different attitudes toward money. And my generation sort of had it from more than one angle. And then world events and politics, the Cold War. When I was a kid growing up, it was everywhere. There were made-for-TV movies, and there were actual movies. I think some of the Mad Max movies were related to a post-apocalyptic, you know, post-nuclear war. But I remember as a kid having nightmares about, like, nuclear bombs going off and this radiation, sort of running from the radiation. And that would seem like just maybe some odd little thing that I went through. But I remember talking to friends as a kid, and it was not unusual. And even, you know, teachers in school talking about the fact that this might happen, that lots of kids were having these dreams. This idea that Russia and the U.S. were going to accidentally push the button or have some kind of miscommunication or intentionally get so pissed off at each other that they were going to blow the world up. That affected my generation. And then you had Nixon getting impeached. I mean, as I forget how old I was, maybe 7 years old, to find out that the president was, you know, fired and kicked out. You know, when you're a kid, you don't know much about Democrat or Republican. You just know there's this president and he's powerful. And to find out he had done something really, really wrong and was sort of fired was you know, it's just surprising to a lot of us at that age. Any thoughts you have, Steve, on any of these?
Yeah, when you talk about events, one of the things that I often throw out in this kind of a conversation is, do you remember where you were when Kennedy died?
Yeah.
And what I find is, you know, for me, I remember very explicitly where I was when we heard the news that JFK was assassinated. And yet my children remember when John Jr. had the plane crash.
Yeah. Or where were you when the towers, you know, were hit?
Exactly.
For the younger kids. Okay. So I'll go through this one kind of quickly. The traditionalists, their nickname is the silent generation. And I had heard this before. I wasn't exactly sure why. And I found 3 different theories. One was that this was the generation of children should be seen and not heard, right? If you were upset when somebody died, nobody took you to a therapist or a shrink or anything like that. You just sort of moved on with life. And so the silent generation, because children should be seen and not heard. There was the Joe McCarthy years where he was a senator that, and maybe everybody's familiar with this, but he was really sort of paranoid about communist infiltration into America, and there were blacklists, and famous comedians and actors and all kinds of people for various reasons were thought to be communist and were ostracized in American society. So another reason to just be silent. And then I think the most popular reason given for the silent generation name is that in 1951 there was this Time magazine article that described the generation as unimaginative, withdrawn, unadventurous, and cautious. And they used the name silent generation to refer to this generation, and it just kind of stuck. So to go a little bit more into the characteristics of traditionalists, a main word that's used, and a lot of this is adapted from the book When Generations Collide. It's on my slide at the end, and I really recommend it as a single book that really looks at the various generations from a number of angles. That's great. Loyal. They were considered to be the loyal generation. They went through 2 world wars and the Great Depression. As I've said before, there was a lot of scarcity, few material things. Life was hard in those years from 1900 to 1945, really hard. And they were seen as just really being loyal. The idea that you would set aside the needs of the individual, and then you could accomplish great things by setting aside those needs. Certainly both wars reinforced that idea. The idea of partnering with large institutions can get things done. We got a man on the moon. We did the atom bomb to end the war. And all of this, you can see how these kinds of things, especially in contrast to the others that I'll go through, really make this a distinct generation and separates one generation from another. Faith in church, government, military. This statistic I really was surprised by. Over 50% of men in this generation were veterans. I mean, it's a huge number of people that were heavily experienced by a military-style life. And they brought that to the corporate world. It was top-down management. Traditionalists are at the top. They tell you what to do. You do it. And people who weren't CEO, they were followers. The leader tells me what to do, and I do it. You don't complain. You don't give another opinion. You don't have a discussion or a meeting. You know, leaders tell you what to do, and the troops follow. Men worked. Women very much tended to stay at home. It was the old school cooking and cleaning for women, and the men worked, and there was, you know, rarely divorce back then. People stayed together regardless. And at work, like I said, it was a chain of command style of management. The leaders led, and the followers obeyed. So the baby boomers, let me just get caught up here. Baby boomers were optimistic and idealistic. So where the traditionalists were seen as loyal, these guys were seen as optimistic and idealistic. And as we've already said, they were massive. They changed every market, the stock market, the supermarket, the job market. It was highly competitive, as you can imagine. You have 80 million people born in such a short period of time. Remember, 75 million traditionalists over 45 years. That's spread out. You have 18 post-war babies. I mean, you have 18 years post-war, creating 80 million babies at the same time. It was really competitive. Lots of consumer products after the war. All the industrial war machine was turned over to making toys and electronics, and they loved their consumer products. TV was invented in 1952. There was only 4 million TV sets. 8 years later, 50 million TV sets. And when you think about a shared experience, this is really the first time that this number of human beings could relate to each other about the same exact topic. Think about it. You watch Tuesday night, whatever show. Maybe you could help me out here, Steve. What was a show that these guys might have watched growing up in early?
My family used to gather around my uncle. My uncle was the only one in the family that had a color TV, and Sunday nights we'd go down and watch Disney World in color.
There you go, Disney World in color. And so the next day, whether you were at school or work, 80 million people, you know, and not just the boomers, then you have the kids and everyone else. You have 80 million people, plus or minus, who could actually talk about the same exact thing because they had all been to the same show the night before. It's like 80 million people being in a theater and being able to talk about it afterwards. That's really significant. You can't overemphasize what a difference that was to have a humongous group of people, just a huge group, that could all talk about the same show they saw at the same time the night before. The booming post-war economy, as I said, lots of opportunity. The traditionalist parents put their energy outward into, you know, war and depression and really trying to just deal with all of that. The boomers were more idealistic and wanted to fix America and the world, and that's where they're sometimes called the me generation, because they didn't have to focus out on all these big problems. They were able to focus on their own ideals and what they wanted to change, and they were able to choose things like civil rights and women's rights and reproductive rights and the pill and environmentalism, and not just have to, you know, deal with war and crisis, but they were able to. You know, it's interesting, me generation, I think sometimes they're they were called the Me Generation as a criticism by the older traditionalists. But another way of looking at it is they were able to just sort of take some time and pick what they valued most and choose where they wanted to make an impact on the world instead of simply just, fighting the next war. The conflict at work that occurred was the change of command style of these guys. They challenged the traditionalists and the top-down authority, and they didn't believe in sort of need to know in terms of information at work. They were much more for open open communication, and so they challenged the traditionalists before them. Let me see. So we'll go to Gen X. So we have the Gen Xers were known as skeptical and independent. Everything was called into question. The presidency, as I've already said, the military. You had Vietnam, where World War I, World War II, the whole country was pretty much behind the military. Vietnam was complicated. Some people held it against the soldiers themselves, which was awful. Even people who didn't hold it against the soldiers thought the country was making mistakes. Some people didn't, but it was a real split kind of situation, and this was really different from the generations before. The divorce rate tripled, as I've said before. There were movies and popular culture that reflected this. Kramer versus Kramer was a sort of a famous divorce movie, and War of the Roses was almost like a dark humor depiction of divorce and what was happening. Much more faith in individualism than in institutions. And you had, cable TV, microwaves came, the video games went from Pong to, much more sophisticated games, and VCRs came as well. Definitely not all fun and games. You had the AIDS epidemic, which was huge and scary as these kids were growing up. The crack epidemic, which, there was always something on the news about crack and crack babies, and moms were going to be having these crack babies that were born addicted to crack and were going to be like these horrible, killing machines that were just going to ruin society. And, I added the milk cartons and kids in milk cartons. When I was really young, milk was just sitting on the table, and it was something nice you put on your cereal. And then at some point, they started putting pictures of missing children on the milk carton. And I remember as a kid seeing that for the first time and noticing it, and it was really kind of a disturbing thing when you're just having your cereal and getting ready to go to school to see that some kid was abducted in some way, and he's now staring at you from the milk carton. I mean, it really was a disturbing way to start the day and go off into the world. Latchkey kids, as I mentioned before, kids who would let themselves in after they got home as opposed to having a parent there. And the conflict at work for these guys was that they were self-command management style. They wanted to be self-reliant in the workplace. And the boomers, while they certainly changed from traditionalist military style, weren't exactly prepared for the Gen Xers and the demands that they would make for kind of self-management and self-reliance. And the Gen Xers were able to get a lot of what they wanted in terms of workplace accommodations, in terms of management style, and in terms of vacation and days off and all of that, because they're such a small group compared to the group before them, that there was a lot of there were a lot more jobs and opportunities than there were people to fill them. So supply and demand, Gen Xers could ask for what they wanted, and they tended to get it. And that led to resentment, especially with the traditionalists. Mm-hmm. I'm just noticing the time. I want to keep it moving. Let's go to Gen Y. They were known as, they're a little bit of each of the previous generations in terms of their main descriptors. Loyal, optimistic, with a splash of skepticism. This was a highly kid-centered childhood. They tend to like their parents, and they're very close with their parents. And listen to this statistic. 90% of Gen Yers in a research study, 90% said that they were very close with parents. 90% of Gen Yers close with parents. 40% of baby boomers, okay, almost half of the baby boomers said that they were better off without any parents at all.
Wow.
Is that incredible?
Wow.
That's huge, right? 90% of Gen Y, very close with parents. 40% of baby boomers, I would have been better off without any parents at all. And I know, thinking about my own mom, who's a boomer, her parents, yeah, they were harsh, and they were old school, and they lived through the wars and the Depression, and it wasn't touchy-feely. And they came, a lot of the boomers came out, not all by any means, but 40% came off feeling like, yeah, I didn't really need that, whereas they turned around their style, and I think Gen Xers as well, and so you had these Gen Yers who were raised by people who had those traditional parents and then turned it around and sometimes went too far in the other direction. These kids grew up with everyone gets a medal, which is part of that flip from traditional, you got to earn what you get and keep your mouth shut. The Gen Yers, it's the every kid gets a medal kind of athletics. It doesn't matter what place you come in, doesn't matter if you win or lose, just try your best and you get a medal, which led this generation to go into the workplace and feel like they should be rewarded with salary and all kinds of great things just because they showed up to work and participated. Those kinds of things from the everyone gets a medal translates into the workplace.
Everybody's CEO.
Yeah, right. They want it now, and having to earn it by doing hard work isn't necessarily part of the generation. Obviously, there's plenty of individual kids who have that, but as a group, not so much. They experienced 9/11 and terrorism. They're still young. Many of them are not even in high school yet, so we don't know the full effects of in the workforce because some of them are still so young. We have from 13 to 32 years old, so the young end is at 13. These guys grew up, as I said before, they grew up with high-speed internet and devices everywhere. They are tech savvy. They also grew up with the famous violent outbreaks from Columbine, Virginia Tech. We just had Sandy Hook. It's been an unfortunate and frequent part of the lives of these kids. Maybe these kinds of things were happening before, but they weren't as, in the media as much. But for Gen Y, they grew up with these things all over the place. They appreciate diversity, and they expect it. It's really important for these folks, the Gen Yers, when they are in the workplace. They want racially diverse workplace and all kinds of diversity. I mean, nowadays, for a kid to be gay in high school, I'm sure this isn't true all over the country, but in many parts of the country, for a kid to be gay in high school is certainly nothing close to what it was 20 years ago or 40 years ago. And there's just a lot more acceptance and diversity, and they appreciate it, and they expect it, and they want it. I threw in the Bill Clinton thing because it was just really interesting in terms of the generations. I mean, Bill Clinton, I don't know if you remember this, Steve, or anyone out there, but when he played saxophone on Arsenio Hall, it was huge. They were replaying it over and over again. It was the first president to really be cool when campaigning. Do you remember that?
I think he wore sunglasses, too, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, he was bluesed out like the Blues Brothers. He had the sunglasses. He was a great sax player, and I mean, it was a really spectacular thing. And I remember at the time, Republicans he was running against, I can't remember the names, but I remember them trying. One guy tried to sing, and it was more of like a Frank Sinatra type crooning, and he got the young vote because it was a matter of like a blues guy with sunglasses versus a guy who was really going for a much older crowd, and it was just really a big pop culture phenomenon at the time. The conflict at work was that they want to collaborate. They want to collaborate virtually. They want to collaborate live. They don't care whether it's live or virtual, texting, Skyping, whatever it is. They can do it any which way, and this was much different than everybody before them. Just keeping an eye on the clock here and seeing where we're at. I will forge ahead. Attitudes toward work.
Keep moving, Jeff.
Keep moving, yeah. Just tell me if I'm speaking too fast. I just want to try to get it all in. So attitudes toward work. Quick overview. Traditionalists, grateful for a job and food on the table. It was that simple, right? The two wars, the Depression. I got a job, I got food, I'm good. The boomers, they lived to work. Workaholics. Gen X was about balance. They want to work to have a life. And the Gen Y millennials, it's about flexibility. Work isn't everything. I've got other things to do. So for the traditionalists, they felt that they owed their employer a good day's work, where the Gen Xers, for example, feel like, and again, it's economics, supply and demand. There's a really small group. There's a lot of jobs out there, so I want the place that's going to give me no weekends. I want the place that's going to give me extra vacation. And the traditionalists felt that they owed their employer a good day at work. Relatives lived close. There really were no daycare costs. There was usually somebody at home to help with daycare. No pressure to do a million extracurricular activities. The GI Bill helped with college and the first home. There were also, it was also a shorter workday for the traditionalists. They had a pretty good deal in lots of ways. It was a shorter workday. One paycheck went really far, so you could also afford to have someone home to be with the kids and not have the child care costs. There were perfect attendance awards back then, and there was competitiveness over who could get perfect attendance, whereas nowadays, like I said, Gen X wants personal days to be able to take a day off work, a mental health day. There was no mental health. There was no mental health day back then. There was no mental health back then, in terms of, the whole psychotherapy thing that I talked about in later generations. These guys went to work and they were proud of it and they went every day. And they came to resent Gen X and Gen Y who came along and were able to ask, particularly the small Gen X, ask for all these extras when they had worked so hard and took such pride in, attendance and doing their thing, to have other generations come up and ask for this balance thing.
Mm-hmm.
Another research stat that was interesting, twice as many traditionalists feel that work-life balance is not handled fairly compared to boomers and Xers. So boomers and Xers feel like it's handled more fairly. The traditionalists, twice as many of them feel that it's unfair, and it's for these reasons. They work so hard, and then the subsequent generations, want all the days off and this balanced life thing. The boomers live to work. Workaholism is an absolute honor. I read an example. One guy talked about how he would work on weekends, and then his way of subtly taking digs at coworkers was to go to work on Monday and say, "Hey, did you guys know that the air conditioning shuts down at 6 p.m. on Sundays?" As if he was talking about the air conditioning when, clearly he was letting everybody know, "Yep, I was here 6 o'clock on Sunday." I mean, just kind of obnoxious, kind of hilarious.
But it comes on at 1 o'clock in the Jeff. But it comes on at 1 o'clock in the morning, Monday morning.
Right. Right. So they're face to face. They're beginning to retire now, and they're starting to see that they want more meaning and they want a slower pace. As the boomers are huge, they're retiring and they want something different, and they're starting to question marriage and work and how they've handled everything in their lives. And one example of sort of questioning marriage and work in this midlife crisis that the boomers are famous for is the movie American Beauty, with Kevin Spacey goes through, and his wife, they both go through this whole affair and midlife crisis. That's sort of almost an exaggeration or a caricature of the kind of super workaholism that they went through for so long, and then they get the empty nest and they question everything. And in general, boomers are looking for more meaning and a slower slower pace. Let me see. I'm having trouble getting an
There you go.
Gen Xers, they want balance, and it's not that they're lazy. They're not lazy. And they're sometimes accused of that, but they want both life and work. And they saw their traditionalist or baby boomer workaholic parents work really hard and then maybe get laid off or lose the pensions that they had. And so they are willing to work hard, but they also want to have a life along the way. Like I said, the baby boomers are retiring and starting to say, "Hey, I wish I had a little bit more meaning in my life." The Xers say, we want it now. We want to include it and weave it into the life we have. 80% of Xers said that a work schedule that allows time for family is more important than challenging work or a high salary. That's significant. And 37% still feel that it's not achieved. They saw their boomer parents pay the price. They hate meetings. They hate micromanagement. Why do you need to see me get quality work done? I could do it at home. I could do it on off hours. I could do it at night if I get it done. Why do you need to see me? Well, certainly traditionalists tend to want people in the office and want that face-to-face contact. And as I said before, they've been able to demand, partly because of supply and demand and the small numbers and the number of people that want and need them, vacation and getting home at a reasonable time and fewer weekends. Gen Y, millennials, flexibility, work is not everything, but their balance, it's the same word, right, balance, as the Gen Xers, but balance to Gen Y means doing a lot of things as well as you possibly can. Balance on steroids, I called it. And what happened there is in 2009, you had the absolute peak of college applicants. You had more college applicants applying for college spots than you ever had in the history of human beings, in the history of college. And they were so huge that they're going through some some of what the boomers went through in terms of how competitive the boomers were because there were so many of them. And so these guys want balance, but that means being able to work and play a sport and play an instrument and do all the things that they can. And then they wanted to work like when they were kids. Overprogrammed as kids, very close with their parents, as I've said before. They asked their parents for advice on homes and major purchases. When they were growing up, their parents included them and their feedback on where should we go on vacation and what should we buy, which TV should we buy. Very, very close. In one of the books I read, they were talking about how in a lot of corporate America, parents and these Gen Yers are so close that the parents might email a resume into a company, the parent email it in, or call an interviewer after the interview, call the kid's interviewer to kind of follow up, which is, to me, outrageous. But again, the generations are very different, and this is the kind of relationship they have with their parents. Many of them are moving back home after college. And on the slide, you can see the priorities for their next job. Financial reward is down the bottom. They want interesting work, meaningful work, work-life balance, financial reward. All right. I want to keep us moving as I look at the time. Let me try to do this next part quickly. As I said in the beginning, this balancing family and business, it's a long-term process, and it really requires proactive management. Aside from just being a family, aside from running a business and being successful, families and business together have to really take the time to manage this interplay of family and business. You can't just hope it works out. I've seen people try that. Occasionally it works, but if you don't really manage it and focus on it, you'll either run into trouble or lose positive opportunities, and it's really both. It's not just, you'll run into, some of these dramatic situations you hear in the news or TV where there's sort of negative conflict. It's not only negative that will happen if you don't manage the interplay. You also can lose a competitive advantage and an opportunity to harness positive stuff. Great example of that is how many non-family companies do you think can the current CEO get the last two CEOs prior to him or her for guidance? It probably doesn't happen all that often. But in a family business, we're talking about getting dad and grandpa to sit down and talk about the history of the business and maybe discuss a tough situation and get their input on that. And a great example for that on TV and popular culture is the show Gold Rush on Discovery. I don't know if anyone out there watches it, but it's on Friday nights. I think the next episode starts tomorrow night of the next season. But it's a reality TV show about these guys gold mining in Alaska. And there's this one storyline of a kid, Parker Schnabel, he was a high school kid when it started. Now he just graduated, and instead of going to college, parents are giving him the college money to continue gold mining. And it's the third-generation family gold mine. But what's great about it, it's a great example of taking the generations and really harnessing the positive power of generations working together. It's so easy to look at the potential for fighting, and again, everything, and the media loves these stories of wealthy family businesses that are gone awry because they're fighting with each other. But I can't emphasize enough that harnessing the positive aspects of generations working together is crucial.
That's important because that helps build that legacy that we always talk about at the Network of Family Businesses, Jeff.
Exactly. I'm going to pretty much skip this slide because of time. I was going to talk about the general best practices for families in 10 seconds, clarifying what the mission is and the values that you share individually and as a family, taking the time to make sure that you're communicating, regular meetings. There's a research bullet there, 85% of family business failures. So these guys, Williams and Pricer, took a look simply at the failures, not all family businesses, but only the ones that they defined failed. And 85% of the ones that failed, they were caused by a lack of communication, trust, and lack of a well-prepared next generation. All of those have to do with communication. It's important to professionalize governance. And again, this best practices is another sort of a whole webinar and then some. So I'm just kind of doing an overview. But an example of generations coming together to harness the positive aspect of generations and mission and values was the J&J Tylenol tainting of many years ago. I think that was probably in the 80s. I don't remember for sure. But what happened was there was one school at J&J that said when someone was putting poison in Tylenol, and Tylenol over the world, people were stopping buying it, and they didn't know what to do. Do they recall all the Tylenol in the world, which was massive amounts of money, or do they just recall little lots that they think are the tainted ones? And as the story goes, they went back to the, General Robert Wood Johnson, who started Johnson & Johnson. They went back to the credo and the values, which J&J is very big on, and one of the elements had to do with always putting the needs and the well-being of people we serve first. And so by going back to the original generation and looking at how they had handled that across generations, they said, mission and values can help you make decisions in tough times. And they harnessed that, and they recalled all of it, and it was incredibly expensive, and they recalled all of it, and they came up with a tamper-proof top to protect people in the future, and sales, I think, tripled or something in the years immediately after that. It was just a classic example of, like, let's really just stick to our roots and our values, and that will guide our decision-making. And it worked for them. Let's see. A couple more slides. I think we can blow through it. Should I go for these next two real quick?
Go quickly, and we have a couple of questions here we can talk about, and we'll be good.
Yeah, I'll go real quick. So integrating the generations in a family business in terms of work-life balance. One thing you can do, there's a great chapter in the book, When Generations Collide, and you can read the chapter together and then just kind of discuss the issues that come up. There's one chapter just on work-life balance. Certainly the whole book is great to read together, but even the one chapter on work-life balance is something you can do quickly as a family and have some great conversation. Always, in terms of these issues, it's important to manage and clarify expectations, to try to be transparent about what you're doing and why, and certainly gather input from people. Areas that you might want to discuss around work-life balance, length of the workday, can you work from home, flex time, everything right here on the slide. Is compensation related to hours put in, or is it related to goals accomplished? And that's, significant when you might have someone in the office working on administrative things and someone out of the office doing sales, or maybe just running around on the golf course with a cell phone. Does the guy with the cell phone on the golf course who's making great sales and make as much or more as the sibling who's in the office, working 9 to 5? Is it the goal accomplished? Is it the amount of time you put in? Those are all things to think about. When is face-to-face time essential? And as always, reevaluate whatever it is you come up with to make sure that it's working for everybody. Trying to get the next slide here.
There we go.
There you go. In terms of technology and the generations, and again, I'm going kind of quick because I know we're near the end, but we have, the Gen Y. These guys were born swiping phones and using technology. It's important to think out the boundaries around family and business and technology. Is it okay to, if mom is the CEO, is it okay to text her about Thanksgiving, but not okay to text her in her role as CEO? In a non-family business, you certainly would not text the CEO with a question. So is that something you want or don't want in the family business? Does that take away from the boundaries between family and business? Is it a healthy combining of boundaries? There's no right or wrong around these things. They're just things you need to think through so that they're sort of managed and people know what to expect. An interesting example around technology and voicemail, Gen Y, and I see this from nieces and nephews and people I know this age, there seems to be this thing of not liking to speak on the phone at all. So they prefer to avoid speaking on the phone. And I know a lot of Gen Yers won't even answer the phone or check the voicemail. They might answer it if you're programmed into their phone as a contact and they can see it's you. But even then, sometimes they just don't like it, and you can leave them a voicemail. They typically don't even listen to the voicemail, but they'll text you back. They prefer the text, not even the email. The email's a pain in the butt. They really want that text. So you can call them. They'll see it's you. They'll let it go to voicemail. Then they'll text you to say, hey, what's up? But they didn't listen to the voicemail, which might have had important information on it. That's kind of a generational thing. Is that okay for the workplace? Is that okay in the family business? If the founder's a traditionalist and they're dealing with a grandson who's in the business and about business, and they're leaving a voicemail that's important for the running of the business, is it okay to just send a text back saying, hey, what's up? Or are you expected to listen to that voicemail even if you don't, outside of work? Let me just, okay. One more quick example. Traditionalists. I was working with a law firm where you had a traditionalist founder and a Gen X daughter, and she's a partner, so it's father and daughter. He's the traditionalist, she's the Gen X, she's a partner. And the father refused to use email. And this is in a law firm where email is the bread and butter of what they do, especially the type of work that they were doing. There's emailing all the time. And the father just simply refused to use email, and it was making life really, really hard on the daughter and on the firm. They were losing efficiency. Clients were frustrated. Is that okay as a traditionalist to just say, you know what, that's not for my time, I'm not going to do it? Or is it important to figure out a way either to use it or to get an administrator to help you so that you can, help the business do what it needs to do to be successful? Again, a little quick on those last two slides because I want time for questions. These are the two books that I recommend. When Generations Collide really is a good overview. The plugged-in Generation Y guide is a lot on Gen Y, but there's a chapter about the 4 generations that's excellent there as well. I'm going to take a deep breath because I know I went kind of quick there, but I really want to open it up to any questions that there are floating out there.
Jeff, here's a question. With all of the information that you presented today, let me get this right here. How do we help each generation learn and accept where the other generations are and how they function?
I think a lot of it is it's, and not to kind of sound trite or repetitive, but it's this communication thing, and it's really structuring it. Take time to meet together and talk about what each generation experienced and how you're different. And, like the J&J example, younger generations should feel free to learn lessons from the older generations. So again, it's not just about avoiding conflict here. It's also about, the lessons learned, the stories for older generations to be able to tell their story to the younger generations, and for the younger generations to be able to tell their shorter but just as important story to the older generations and explain what they've experienced and how that all works. It's just, a lot of communication. Did that address it? Could you read the question again?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I would expand it to here. There's another comment regarding succession planning and the differences in the generations. When do you start and how do you do it?
Early. Too many times. I've seen this. Oh man, I've seen, like I said as an example earlier in the webinar, 50-year-olds, 55-year-old guys, 58-year-old guys whose parents are in their 80s, and the succession plan is someday this will all be yours. Yeah. Nothing more formal, nothing on paper. You've got to start early, and you've got to really put time into it. You've got to set aside time, meetings, where you really discuss the interplay of the family and the business, the development of the next generation. What are the expectations for the next generation? The one slide on best practices that I went through kind of quickly, part of a mission and values is also some families put together a constitution where they sit down and they say, okay, how is this going to work? Who gets to work in the business? Can anyone work in the business, during the summer in high school and college? But in order to get a job at the business, you have to get a college degree first. And if you get a college degree and you work at the business, do you have to get a graduate degree to move into management? Or do you have to work for a year at, a similar company in a different part of the country, or maybe a completely different company somewhere else? Like, just thinking through how you want to develop the next generation. But it's a long-term process. You can't wait till someone's 50 and resentful that they're waiting for an 80-year-old to, get sick or die. Not to sound harsh, I see this all the time. You've got to start early. You've got to make some agreements. And I'm a true believer that the senior generation really has to step back at some point, not wait until they're old or infirm or dead, but to really at some point plan things so that they can step back and then the next generation can have their opportunity without having to wait forever for it. If the family's goal is really to go from generation to generation, you can't just do that because, as I said in the beginning, people are living longer and longer, and if you don't start early and really get clear on how this is going to work, you'll have 80-year-olds waiting for 110-year-olds to step back.
Yeah. Jeff, you have really done a fantastic job of giving us excellent generational perspectives, and this has been very exciting and very positive. I think as I kind of reflect back a little bit here on what you've covered, the vast amount of information you've given us to think about and process, I think I would recommend to our membership not only those books, but some things maybe that they can start with right this afternoon with their family. And I guess one would be recognizing the generational differences, and don't let it intimidate you or keep you from talking and working with the next generation. As you said, celebrate and capitalize on the differences. I think too many times the older generation, and I'll just use that generically, is afraid of the younger generation or to talk. So don't let it intimidate you. The second point I guess I would make, Jeff, in this succession planning, recognize, as you very well pointed out, where some of the potential clash points might be, and actually turn that into opportunities to strengthen the family and the business. And I think that's a key point you made there too. And thirdly, what I know we say all the time, talk with your children. Talk with your children.
Yep.
So, Jeff, again, thank you so much. The Network of Family Businesses wants to thank you for your insights and education on this topic, and as families work to build their legacies and nurture the next generation. For those of you who want more information or want to talk with Jeff, his information is there on the screen, but for those of you who are listening to the podcast, let me give you his phone number is 732-296-8047. And his email is jsavlov@bloomandsavlov.com, or you can contact him through the Network of Family Businesses. This presentation will be recorded and placed in the archive as well as the podcast. We want to thank all our members for joining us today. Again, my name is Steve Moyer, and thank you for joining us. And remember, it's all about the network, helping families build their legacy. Jeff, thanks again.
Thanks for being with us, everybody.